David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So on the program before, I've done several videos sort of analyzing and dissecting these absolutely ridiculous and embarrassing, very ignorant interviews that our president has given. And most of those interviews have been of pretty huge interest to the audience, which is good. I mean, it's good that when I do a dissection of an interview and really go into detail about what is being implied, what is said, what is not said, the sort of broader circumstances in which these interviews are taking place. It's good that that does well because it just signals that the audience is actually interested in going beyond just the most superficial stuff that happens in American politics. A lot of those interviews have gotten 500,000 views on YouTube, 750,000. I think some of those analyses have even gotten like 1 million views on YouTube. Those all pale in comparison to an Oval Office interview that Donald Trump just gave to ABC News and George Stephanopoulos that doesn't require really anything beyond just the most superficial analysis, because at its core, what Donald Trump is saying is that he's willing to collude with foreign countries that are interested in helping him win the 2020 election. Donald Trump saying, to the extent that colluding with foreign countries is criminal, whether it's conspiracy to collude or emoluments violations, receiving things of value, he's interested in doing that in 2020 if anybody has dirt on potential 2020 opponents for him, and he wouldn't go to the FBI. So let's just kind of back up and set this up. George Stephanopoulos asking Donald Trump about, given everything that happened in 2016, if countries came to you in 2020 with dirt on your opponents, what would you do? Let's check out the first piece of this absolutely insane video.
Your son, Don Jr., is up before the Senate Intelligence Committee today. And again, he was not charged with anything. In retrospect, though,
by the way, not only wasn't he charged, if you read it, with all of the horrible fake news, I mean, I was reading that my son was going to go to jail. This is a good young man, that he was going to go to jail. And then the report comes out, and they didn't even say, they hardly even talked about him.
Should he have gone to the FBI when he got that email?
Okay, let's put yourself in a position. You're a congressman. Somebody comes up and says, hey, I have information on your opponent. Do you call the FBI? I don't think.
Coming from
I'll tell you what,
you do.
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI. You throw somebody out of your office. You do whatever you do.
Al Gore got a stolen briefing book. He called the FBI.
Well, that's different. A stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent.
Trump's right. The initial information that he was offered in the Trump Tower meeting might not have been stolen, but then he asked Russia to steal information. He's acting like the theft of the information is relevant, but he asked for information on Hillary and the DNC to be illegally hacked and stolen. Can you obtain those 30,000 missing emails? You'll be rewarded for it, Russia, if you're listening. We'll play that clip later on, but let's go back just a few seconds here in the George Stephanopoulos interview and pick it back up.
Well, that's different. A stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it. If I thought there was something wrong, I'd go maybe to the FBI if I thought there was something wrong. But when somebody comes up with Oppo research, right, they come up with Oppo research. Oh, let's call the FBI. The FBI doesn't have enough agents to take care of it. But you go and talk honestly to congressmen. They all do it. They always have. And that's the way it is. It's called Oppo research.
That's right. He would do it again. I mean, truly, congratulations to George Stephanopoulos for this interview. A really good job done by him, eliciting all of the things that we feared most, but sort of anticipated Donald Trump would say about this, even with that speech pattern. Have you noticed that when Donald Trump picks up on a word or phrase that he likes, He'll then use it repeatedly 3 or 4 times in a minute sometimes. In this case, Oppo research. It's a very unusual speech pattern that he has, which we have talked about before and we could get into, but it's popping up here again. But to get to the core of the substance here, understand what is taking place. Donald Trump wants us to believe he didn't collude in 2016. He didn't know anything about Russian help for his campaign. He had no idea that Russia wanted him to be elected president over Hillary Clinton. He's totally innocent in all ways. But if this time around Russia came around with information for him about whoever is going to be his 2020 opponent, he would absolutely take it, and he probably wouldn't go to the FBI with that. Nothing says no collusion with Russia like admitting that you're open to collusion with Russia in 2020. And this is why there have to be consequences, because without them, not only does Donald Trump get away with it in 2016, which he did, and he's going to, he actually becomes emboldened like a little kid and says, I do it in 2020 as well. And conservative David Frum had some interesting tweets about this. He says this is like a smoking gun tape of Nixon confessing on national television. David Frum tweeted, quote, like the smoking gun tape if Nixon had confessed on national television to a network anchor instead of in the secrecy of the Oval Office to his most trusted aide. Immediately after this clip of the George Stephanopoulos interview went live, the hashtag impeach Trump now immediately trending on Twitter after the interview was published. But I hate to break it to you. If you see this interview and you see what Donald Trump says about 2020 collusion with foreign countries, and you're shocked, you're either not paying attention or deliberately ignorant. Because if any of this is shocking, you haven't read the Mueller report, because all of this willingness to engage in this type of behavior is in the report. If you go by the Barr letter and then you see Donald Trump say this, you might actually experience a moment of cognitive dissonance. How can it be? Barr said no collusion, no obstruction, everything's great. The problem was the investigation, not Trump's behavior. And then you see Trump say, oh, I would accept information about my opponents from foreign countries in 2020. You might see that as a contradiction. If you just read what's in the Mueller report, you would say, oh, yeah, this fits perfectly. This is exactly what Mueller found Donald Trump and the people around him were willing to do and were doing. And as conservative David Frum also added on Twitter, quote, anybody still believe that Don Jr. did not pre-clear his Trump Tower meeting with Russian agents with his father first? I've been saying this from the get-go. Whatever criminality does or doesn't exist in the Trump Tower meeting with Natalia Veselnitskaya, that's not at issue here. The question is, we were told that Donald Trump had no idea that that meeting was being planned, that that meeting was happening, that that meeting took place until much, much later. And I said from the get-go, that's not believable. There's no way that that's the truth. And once again, Donald Trump's answer here is so clear, so concise. Of course, yeah, I would take the help and I wouldn't tell the FBI. Do any of us believe Trump didn't know that that Trump Tower meeting was in development before it took place? I don't believe it for a second. Why is it that our president is regularly choosing other countries over ours? Trump says he would have no responsibility if a foreign country that's outside of our democratic system comes to him as a sitting president with dirt on other candidates, that he would have no responsibility to go to the FBI, that his responsibility would effectively be to use that information to win rather than to try to stop the foreign interference on our elections. This is an open invitation for other countries to now try to ingratiate themselves with Trump in this particular way. It's another signal to Russia or to whoever else that the door is open. Trump wants to hear from you. Does nobody understand that what Donald Trump is saying in this interview with George Stephanopoulos is effectively the same thing as when he said this during the 2016 campaign?
I will tell you this. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. Let's see if that happens. That'll be next.
This interview is that all over again with different vocabulary and Trump as the sitting president rather than Trump as merely a candidate. The Oval Office is not secure. The 2020 election is obviously not safe. And the psychology that we have to apply here is child psychology. I've been reading the book Influence by Robert Cialdini. It's a real classic from 1984. I've never read it before. I'm finally getting around to it. And the elements in the book based on influence and child psychology are very relevant here. When a little kid gets away with something and their misdeeds go unpunished, they become emboldened, not just to repeat those misdeeds, but to take them further and see how far they can actually get. This is how children behave. And incredibly, this is the psychological framework that we need to apply to Donald Trump. George W. Bush was a terrible president. I don't think he was anything like Donald Trump, though, when it comes to we have to deal with Donald Trump like we deal with little kids. You didn't have to deal with George W. Bush like you were dealing with a little kid. You had to deal with him like you were dealing with an individual who has weaponized neoliberalism and foreign policy for political gain, but you didn't have to deal with him like you deal with a little kid in the way that you do with Donald Trump. And that's what we're dealing with here. Are we going to allow all of this to continue with no consequences? I hope the answer is no. Unfortunately, I believe the answer is yes. And I want to hear from you. What do you think about this just incredible interview with George Stephanopoulos? Let me know. Follow me on Twitter and send me a tweet there at @dpakman. The show is also on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Paul Fowler and Derek Benesh. Paul and Derek, thank you for being new members. We are mostly funded by viewers and listeners like Paul and Derek, who do something really simple but really great. They just go to www.joinpakman.com. They hit the red sign up button. If they want, they take advantage of the 40% off coupon code. This is 2020. And then they're members. It takes under a minute. You're directly supporting. You're voting with your dollars and saying, here's a show I want to support. Let me help make it financially sustainable. And someone who has been doing that for almost 5 years as a member is Keith Victor. Keith is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. He's been a member since 2014, just under 5 years. And really appreciate not only our longtime members like Keith, but also new folks like Paul and Derek. www.joinpakman.com. Sign up today. Takes under a minute, and it is very much appreciated, particularly in the wake of what appears to be a growing Adpocalypse 3.0 on YouTube. We're up to version 3 now. We've really gone through these development phases quickly, and we're going to be in the final release version of Adpocalypse soon. A permanent Adpocalypse is what, unfortunately, many in the progressive independent media world are telling me behind the scenes. We have a David Pakman Show subreddit, which has nearly 11,000 subscribers from our audience now. You can find it at davidpakman.com/Reddit. People ask me, David, why don't you give us the actual Reddit address? Because it's very long. It's reddit.com/r/The David Pakman Show. It's much easier to just say davidpakman.com/Reddit. I got a couple emails last week, people saying, David, you're trying to get phony traffic to your website by using a redirect. No, I'm not. It's just easier to say davidpakman.com/Reddit. It will redirect you to our subreddit. A couple of notable posts and discussions from the last couple of days that I want to point out to you. Once again, another post saying, I really want Dave to debate Candace. I don't know if that debate is ever going to happen. A lot of you may remember that at one point, it seemed as though Kyle Kulinski and I were going to do a 2-on-2 debate with conservative people. I'm lacking in the right words here. Conservative individuals, Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk at Politicon 2018, back in October in Los Angeles. It turns out that I guess they were never really doing it, or at least Candace was not. And then it looked as though I was told by a third party that was organizing a debate that Candace Owens had agreed in principle to debate me, and we were just finalizing topics and the dates. Tentatively, one of those dates was March 18th. As you might know, looking at a calendar, March 18th has long come and gone. And it doesn't seem at this point that there's any reasonable opportunity for me to debate Candace Owens. It doesn't seem that she wants to do it. To be clear, it's not me that is holding it up. It is Candace, and that invitation remains open. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, a post pointing out that there is a Dave Rubin event in Rockland, California on June 22nd. And a couple of people in the comments said that they are planning to go. And what should they ask related to the David Pakman Show? So I'll just tell you right now, because you might remember Dave Rubin recently said during a public event when asked about interviewing me that he is not against it in principle, but that I've lied about him many times. He said Pac-Man has lied about me a bunch of times. And I've asked for, and others have been asking for, what those lies were. So if you go to a Dave Rubin event and you get the opportunity to ask a question that will almost definitely get the video clip on the show is asking Dave Rubin, what specific lies did David Pakman tell about you? That would be a really great question to ask Dave Rubin. Another great question for Dave Rubin. Did you watch, and if so, what did you think of David Pakman's Joe Rogan appearance? Another question would be, David Pakman has said he would like to talk to you publicly about the rift between the two of you. Are you willing to do that? What preconditions would you need? Like if David Pakman was willing to not mention the phrase marketplace of ideas, for example, would that be a reasonable precondition for you to agree to a conversation with David Pakman? Do you think you and David Pakman will ever reconcile your relationship? Would be an interesting question for Dave Rubin. And I think most people in our audience who are aware of what's going on can probably come up on their own with other interesting and relevant questions for Dave Rubin at his events, video of which would almost be guaranteed to make it onto the program. Presuming the audio and video quality is good, please, no vertical recording. Record horizontally. Horizontal recording, much more likely to make it onto the program. These and many other interesting conversations, including others about policy. It's not all about gossip within the online media community. Happening with almost 11,000 of our viewers and listeners daily on the David Pakman Show subreddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Yesterday, I reported to you that the Donald Trump campaign did some internal polling in a number of key battleground states, and that Donald Trump currently, according to his own campaign's internal polls, is losing some major important 2016 battleground states to most, if not all, likely Democratic challengers in hypothetical one-on-one matchups. Trump's reaction, as I told you yesterday, was bury the polls, say we're doing great, period. Now, unfortunately, at the same time that Donald Trump's campaign was doing internal polling in a lot of these battleground states, other regular pollsters were also doing polls in those battleground states, and the public polls say the exact same thing. Donald Trump is not doing particularly well right now in one-on-one matchups in a number of key states, including Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and others. Now, Donald Trump has been presented with the public polls showing that he's currently losing to every major 2020 Democratic candidate in these hypothetical 2020 matchups, and Trump has absolutely lost it and is now claiming that the polls are totally fake. Donald Trump tweeting in a tweet storm, quote, "The fake news has never been more dishonest than it is today. Thank goodness we can fight back on social media. Their new weapon of choice is fake polling, capital F in fake, capital P in polling, sometimes referred to as suppression polls. They suppress the numbers, had it in 2016, but this is worse. The fake, corrupt news media said they had a leak into polling done by my campaign, which, by the way, and despite the phony and never-ending witch hunt, are the best numbers we have ever had. Lie. I mean, this is all lies. They reported capital F fake numbers, and then that they made up and don't even exist. All caps, we will win again. Now, there are people on the left who actually agree with Trump that the polls are totally fake, and they email me daily and they tell me Joe Biden's not really winning the Democratic primary. Bernie is actually ahead of Biden, or Tulsi is actually polling 10%, not 1%. You can't believe anything that's there. Now, I've already talked about what is and isn't accurate about polling, but the polls are not fake, okay? If your evidence is we know 2020 polls are fake because 2018 polls were totally wrong and fake, and 2016 polls were totally wrong and fake. Well, the 2016 national polls were correct. They had Hillary winning by 2 or 3 points nationally, and she did. Of course, she lost the Electoral College ultimately because of these 77,000 votes in 3 states that were within the margin of error. But the national polls were right in 2016. The national polls were basically right in 2018 as well in terms of what would happen in the Senate with Democrats and Republicans and what would happen in the House with Democrats and Republicans. So I don't know what that contingent of the left is referring to. I don't know what Trump is referring to, because what is now publicly being said in these polls is the exact same thing that Donald Trump's own internal polls of these battleground states are saying. And specifically, Donald Trump, I'm guessing, is referring to a new Quinnipiac poll from this week where Donald Trump is losing to every leading 2020 Democrat. Let's put the results up on the screen. Trump versus Biden, Biden 53, Trump 40. Sanders 51, Trump 42. That's +9 for Bernie. Kamala Harris 49, Trump 41. That's +8 for Kamala. Warren 49 to 42 over Trump. That's +7. Buttigieg and Cory Booker both 47 to 42, +5 over Donald Trump. So normal caveats here. Number one, is it likely that Donald Trump will end up with only 40 or 41% of the vote in the 2020 election? No, Donald Trump is going to get more unless there's a serious third party challenger. Trump's going to get more than 40 or 41%. There are some undecideds in those numbers that are ultimately going to vote most likely for either Trump or the Democratic challenger. There hasn't been, is it likely Trump will lose the popular vote by 7, 8, 9, 10, 13 even, as is being shown in the Quinnipiac poll? Absolutely not. There has not been a popular vote margin of 10 or greater in a presidential election since Ronald Reagan 35 years ago, and it would be very unlikely to happen in 2020. But the main takeaway here, the point is, Trump's not doing well right now, 17 months from the election, in a number of battleground states and nationally against hypothetical Democratic presidential nominees who we don't even actually know who is going to be the nominee yet. There's even a poll. This is amazing. There's a poll showing Trump down to Joe Biden in Texas by 4 points, which is very close to Trump's net favorability in Texas, which is -3, meaning 3 percentage points more see Trump unfavorably in Texas than favorably. But I want to, every time we do polling stuff, I'm going to go back to this because it's so important. And I apologize to people who say I've said this enough. I can't possibly say it enough. I want to caution everyone to be very careful here. We actually want Trump to think that he's winning, because if Donald Trump really thinks the polls are fake, maybe he really does believe that he's currently winning in these head-to-head matchups. That's what we want, because a Trump who thinks he's winning and that he has it in the bag hopefully won't actually go out and campaign, and he'll hang around the White House and he'll play golf and he'll send weird tweets out. And that will make it more likely that he ultimately will lose in 2020. It's really important to understand that we want to, on the one hand, not take for granted, no matter what the polls say, you as an individual voter should operate under the belief that your vote could swing the election to or away from Trump in your state. Okay. And if you take that approach, what you would do on election day, or as soon as early voting starts in your state, is you would go and you would vote. So no matter what the polls say, operate under the guise that your vote could make the difference. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to what Trump thinks about polls, the better Trump thinks he's doing, the less he's going to campaign, the less seriously he's going to take the possibility that he gets defeated in 2020. And we have to remember, systemically, we are at a disadvantage. Gerrymandering favors Republicans, number one. Number two, the urban-rural divide favors Republicans in conjunction with the Electoral College. Number three, when we consider all of the different possible types of interference that Donald Trump said to George Stephanopoulos yesterday he would welcome in 2020 in terms of opposition research, or oppo research, as Trump calls it, against potential Democratic candidates. There's a whole bunch of stuff systemically stacked against us. The voter suppression tactics that they will continue to employ. So the better Trump thinks he's doing, the less likely it is he will take action that might actually help him in 2020. And that's something we shouldn't forget either. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Follow me while you're there at david.pakman. Lots of great behind the scenes pictures from my trip to Los Angeles last week and a lot of other great stuff. We will take a quick break and be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Dr. Sophie Leroy, who is Associate Professor at the University of Washington, Bothell's School of Business. Great to speak to you today. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be on your show.
So let's just start. When we talk about the idea of multitasking, does multitasking even really exist, or is it just switching between one task and another and working on each individually?
You're right. It actually does not fully exist. Like, our brain cannot process two things at the same time. So what we do is actually we switch very quickly between two things or even more. So we feel like we're multitasking when in fact we're not. We're really, again, switching back and forth really, really fast.
So in these tests or studies that are sometimes done where someone is, for example, driving a car on a closed course and there are different obstacles that pop up and they're simultaneously being given simple or sometimes not so simple math problems over the phone. Right. It does seem as though you are both driving and solving the math problems at the same time. But in some sense, are you sort of putting the driving in an autopilot mode as you think about the math problems?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why, from a performance standpoint, this is really problematic, right? Because what it means is that when you do the math problem while you're driving, you're actually not focused on the road. You're not processing what's going on the road. And so you can miss cues, you can miss things that are happening. Your reaction time is delayed because you need something else to capture your attention very fast back on the road. And so when you're on the road and not doing your math problem, you're going to be slower at your math problem because you're actually not processing the math, right? So from a performance standpoint, there are many issues that comes into play due to the fact that because we're switching back and forth, there is a very small time period where you're actually not doing what you're supposed to do.
So when we think about how we might sort of do our work throughout the course of a day, and there is a lot of this, what some people might call multitasking, but is really switching between tasks back and forth. There's the term attention residue, which is an interesting term, which, if I understand correctly, relates to the way in which, as you switch between tasks, some of your attention is not fully there yet or is remaining on the prior task. Is that more or less what we mean when we say attention residue?
That's right. And so it's a little different from the multitasking aspect, right? So multitasking, you're trying to do two things at the same time, and your brain is switching back and forth between those two things. Attention residue is a little different in the sense where it occurs when we work on something and then we have to let it go and transition to something else. And in that case, our brain cannot do that either. We have a hard time transitioning because we have a hard time letting go of things that are incomplete. So attention residue does not necessarily occur all the time, but it occurs when we're not fully satisfied with what we've done, it's not finished, we were interrupted in the middle of that thought process. And as we transition, the brain does not want to let go. In part because we have a need for completion. And so those transitions or those interruptions are really frustrating our need for completion. And so the brain is going to hold on to it, process what's going on that task that we had to put aside. And so what happens is we have actually divided attention. Our brain, in fact, then multitasks. Attention residue is a form of multitasking in the sense that it will go back to the task we were working on previously and then at the same time try to perform what we're supposed to do in the present. So it's a little different, right, in terms of what triggers it, but it's very relevant to the workplace as well, because as you think about how we work, right, oftentimes we have to go from meetings to the next. We're working on a project, boom, there's a phone call, for example, from a client or someone else passing by, a colleague who needs some information and is asking some questions, right? So we have to transition very frequently, and those transitions are just very, very hard for the brain to perform.
So when I interviewed Cal Newport a few weeks ago, who teaches computer science at Georgetown, I believe it is, he suggests this idea of planned deep work, right? Focusing on single intense tasks for long periods of time because you're reducing the number of those transitions that you're referring to. And you can be most sort of productive and thinking most deeply when you spend a long period of time focused on one thing. Of course, the practical issue seems to be that in more and more jobs, 20, 30, 40, even more than half of the job can basically be writing emails and switching to meetings and taking phone calls and those types of activities. So it seems like that is definitely the best ideal, but it seems very impractical for many modern jobs at this point in time.
Absolutely. And that's actually where my what my research focused on is kind of assuming that we can't change our corporate cultures, that this need to get information right away, and kind of we have a sense of urgency, and that triggers a lot of those interruptions. Think about all the technologies that we have is facilitating all those interruptions. And so if we assume that those interruptions are going to stay, then how do we cope with this cognitively, right? So I'm going to go back to this idea that what is the brain in need for? What prevents the brain to transition, to move from one task to another, to move from deep work to deep work? Is this need for completion? And so what I found in my research is that when we're in a position where we are working on something, we are interrupted, is incomplete, we ask to move, we need to spend maybe a minute to create what I call the ready to resume plan. And so it's the same idea of planning, but it's a different implementation of it, which is you stop, you say, okay, what is it that I was doing? Where am I on my project? What is it that I want to do next when I return to it? So especially planning the return is critical for the brain to feel like, okay, I can let go because yes, it's not finished, but I have a plan that will allow me to complete. And so that sense of completion is not as threatened as it is when we just drop everything and switch. So this ready to resume plan, what I've shown is that it actually helps reduce attention residue on the next task. And as a result, performance on that next task actually increased tremendously. I tested it through different ways. It improves the quality of our processing in terms of processing of information. People are able to pay more attention. It improves the quality of the decision making that people engage in. It improves recall of information. So they have to recall information, think that they've read. That also is improved. So what was really interesting is it was a less than a minute intervention, and that led to huge impact on attention and on performance.
Now, what did you learn about, so if you're writing something, for example, and you take a brief break to look at your email and respond to one email, and then you go right back to the writing, how long is the brain affected in terms of limited focus after what might be just 30 seconds to write an email?
It's actually, it's huge. It's really surprising that how, I think it's counterintuitive for a lot of people, how just this very brief interruption would actually affects you when you come back, right? So the issue of switching in that case is you switch to something else, and what happens when you come back? Well, the brain basically has to remember where is it that you were, and what kind of thoughts you kind of, what was your train of thoughts, where you were going, and all of those things. By just switching away for a second, then it's going to take you a long time to remember where you were, to regain the same level of concentration, to remember where you were going. And so it doesn't really, obviously the longer the interruption, the harder that switch back, the harder it is to switch back. But even small interruptions actually are detrimental. And so I think that's where, like, if you're writing something and you have to switch, even if it was just a few seconds, if you kind of put a couple ideas of what you wanted to write, but even, oftentimes people switch because they're kind of like, they don't know what to do next. They're not fully there, or they're bored, or it's kind of a hurdle, right? And so just write like, okay, I need to write about X. I don't know how to, but that's okay. And then you switch and then you return. Oh yeah, now I know it was about X.
That seems to me to be one of the most pernicious elements of the sort of modern task switching, availability of social media at any time that you want, because at some point in the past, if you are writing something and you have a very brief, momentary writer's block, for example,
Yep.
you think through it and maybe in 5 minutes you're past it. But it's so easy and it's so attractive to pick up your phone and look at Facebook or look at Twitter that even only 45 or 60 seconds later, you've now looked at, 30 different posts and thought about 30 different things. It actually seems like it will hinder you from getting past that writer's block in a way that maybe just sitting there quietly for 5 minutes would actually let you work through the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it makes you busy with something else. And, there is some research that shows that when we let things incubate, we actually get new ideas. And so it's not that the issue is less about doing something else, but if that next task is very pulling, very engaging, and even social media, I know to some extent is, you don't have a cognitive space to actually answer your friends while at the same time think about the ideas that you were trying to express or the problem you were trying to solve. And so we're not getting much by switching in that case from a pure creativity standpoint or problem solving standpoint. And so but it's tempting. It's easier. It feels good, right?
Yeah. So, I guess given that it's just our phones and the apps and the internet platforms that we use are designed to keep our attention for as long as possible, how drastic do the measures need to be that one uses or employs to avoid those temptations and distractions? Should you be disconnecting your computer from the internet if it's possible? Well, it's just not practical. Like when I'm preparing for my show, all of my source material is on the internet. So I can't literally disconnect from the internet, but I can put my phone in the other room, for example.
Yes. So there are a couple of thoughts, right? I agree. I think it's, the more you block what is tempting, so it's going to be different things for different people. I think the easier it is to not go there when you're faced with a challenge. One thing that I, for example, do is I will look at the time and I said, okay, for the next 30 minutes, I am not touching anything.
Right.
Right. Now, there's something that that happened to me that I think is interesting and also relevant to this kind of checking out or checking other devices. For the longest time, I would put my phone on vibrate so that I would not be interrupted. But then I realized that I would check it because just in case the kids call cold, for example, or just in case a colleague texts me and I felt like I needed to answer. And I realized that was actually forcing me to transition versus if I have it on volume, then I don't have to worry about it because I will hear it if someone wants to call me. Now, I have to tell you, not a lot of people call me during the day. So, right. So that's also, I know that I can leave that on volume and not be interrupted that much, but it completely removed all my checking behaviors because I know if someone wants to reach me, I will hear them. I don't have to worry about them. And so I allow myself then to have my phone with me. The other thing that I do is very much like you, I do a lot of, in terms of research, I have to be on the internet. And I'm going to tell myself, I am not going to check the news. I'm not going to check anything outside of work, even email for the next 2 hours. But that requires us discipline. But the interesting part of it is I think it's discipline that we can learn. And we can train our attention not to crave for those, fast gratification through social media, for example. We can train our brain to stick with what we're doing for longer time periods, slowly. So that's where I think there's hope, but it depends on what we are willing to do and what our goals are.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like there's an element in this in which the brain is sort of like a muscle that can be strengthened, so to speak, to be better at maintaining attention for longer periods of time. We have been speaking with Dr. Sophie Leroy, who is an associate professor at the University of Washington, Bothell School of Business. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, I know that you will know who I'm talking about right away when I tell you that a Fox News host did something surprising and that it just made some sense. He told the Fox News audience that they should actually just go and read the Mueller report instead of basing their opinion on what pundits say, definitely not on what William Barr's propaganda letter said. And obviously, if you've watched the show before, if you've watched Fox News before, you would know that the anchor I'm talking about is Shepard Smith, who has occasionally pierced the echo chamber of the Fox News audience. Take a look.
Still, Nadler says the committee will have access to some of the special counsel's most important files, and that's according to Nadler, including evidence of possible corruption of justice. Remember, in his 400-plus page report that everyone in America should read, everyone, Robert Mueller laid out 10 instances of apparent obstruction of justice, criminal obstruction of justice, potentially, by President Trump. The special counsel did not exonerate the president, said if they could have, they would have, but they couldn't, so they didn't. Mueller explained that if he and his team had confidence that the president did not commit obstruction, they would have said so. He also said that under Justice Department guidelines, charging the president with a crime was never an option to him. He said the Constitution requires another process. That's what he said.
10 instances of apparent obstruction, potentially criminal, did not exonerate Donald Trump. Would have said Trump didn't do anything wrong if they knew Trump didn't do anything wrong. Justice Department guidelines prevented him from filing charges. Other options exist, referencing, of course, impeachment. How bad has the partisan media industrial complex gotten that it's newsworthy when someone says completely uncontroversial but true things on Fox News that happen not to align with the Republican president's position? And I will go even further, by the way, about reading the report. I understand that this is my job and it's not most people's. So reading a 450-page document with 1,500, 1,300, however many footnotes, I get that that's not feasible for a lot of people. But there's another option. It's not just you read the 450 pages or you go by the 4-page Barr propaganda letter. There is something called the Mueller summary of the report. It's not Mueller's report and it's not Barr's letter. These are executive summaries of the report. Lawfare has these available, which we're linking to if you're watching on YouTube in the video description down below. The Mueller report itself is available as a free audiobook on Audible. We're linking to that down below on the YouTube clip. Do what Fox News host Shepard Smith says. It's crazy for me to be saying that. Read the report, listen to the report, whatever. I've read almost the entire report. I skipped over some of the parts that were more kind of like context, because if you already know the context, I don't know that there was that much more for me to learn from that. But I've come away with much knowledge that I could not have gotten from William Barr's letter. I certainly would not have gotten from Donald Trump's characterization. Number one, Russia's actions impacted the election. They successfully attacked election systems, period. That is in the report. Number two, there are lots of things that probably should be criminal in our country that aren't. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of indirect involvement with criminal or potentially criminal activity that is not a crime, including being a partner to parties committing crimes, even if you benefit from those crimes, even if you had the sense that they were involved in those crimes. If you're not actively coordinating those crimes, a lot of that activity is not criminal. It probably should be. And the problem we have in this country, and I've said it before, and this is just an example of it, on the street crime side, there is way too much criminalization in our country. If you look at the street crime that gets people into jail and prison and into the system, there is over-criminalization that has taken place. Conversely, though, on the white-collar side, on the corporate side, on the political crime side, it's not criminal enough. We don't have enough criminalization. And that is a broader issue that I've been talking about for a long time here. And of course, a headline takeaway from reading the actual Mueller report is that there is substantial evidence meeting all three of the requirements for criminal obstruction of justice by Donald Trump, or in other words, of the 14 possible obstructive acts, 8 of those, according to the Mueller report, meet all three of the requirements to be criminally obstructive acts. Read the report. okay? Start the impeachment inquiry, further publicize the contents. It's time. I don't know what anybody's waiting for. In the continuing saga of all the disgusting and immoral and corrupt things that Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has done, he has now blocked election security bills, and he just so happens to be taking money from voting machine lobbyists. Nice, right? This is a separate story, by the way, from the totally swamp-filling financial dealings of Mitch McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, and her conflicts of interest. That's going to have to be a story for another day. This is other swamp-filling nonsense from Mitch McConnell. Remember, Russian hackers successfully targeted voting machines in 2016, voting systems in 2016. They're likely to do it again in 2020. Intelligence agencies agree. The intelligence agencies of other countries agree. Touchscreen voting machines have no paper trail. Some have no paper trail, which makes it impossible to verify how votes were counted, if they were counted, who they were counted for. And these electronic voting machines can make it impossible not only to find, but even to correct problems in many cases. There are ideas about how to stop this. Both Democrats and Republicans have actually proposed some of those ideas in legislation. Every single bill that has been proposed has been stonewalled by Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And of course, big surprise, it just so happens that the two biggest voting machine companies have hired lobbyists at the federal level who recently have contributed to Mitch McConnell's reelection campaign for Senate in Kentucky. Just delightful, right? The system we have. The two companies I'm talking about are ES&S and Dominion Voting Systems. Between the two of them, those two companies supply 80% of the country's voting machines. They have very significant lobbying operations historically at the state level, but they've now hired federal lobbyists. ES&S hired lobbyist Peck Madigan Jones to lobby the House and Senate. They have significantly funded this federal lobbying spending. Dominion Voting Systems, now owned by a hedge fund based in New York City, also started federal lobbying this year with Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck, a different lobbying firm. Many of the lobbyists working for both of these companies have donated to Mitch McConnell's campaign and to Mitch McConnell's joint fundraising committee. So listen, can we prove that Mitch McConnell is blocking election security bills because of the donations from voting machine lobbyists? No, that's not the point, and that's by design. That's how the system is designed. Even if there isn't actual, provable foul play here, this is a corrupt system. That it is even legal for voting machine companies that tally election results to go and donate money to elected officials who are participating in those elections, which may be tallied by their voting machines, is a sickening but legal status quo in the way things work in this country. Last segment, I said, we have over-criminalization in the street crime world in the United States. We have under-criminalization and under-prosecution and under-conviction and under-penalization of white-collar, corporate, and political crime in the United States. Mitch McConnell is one of the most insidious forces in American politics today, and he has been for years, and very successfully so for Republicans. His role in helping Republicans control the courts, including his amazingly successful, if you're a Republican, obstruction of Obama Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland. Extremely successful from the point of view of Republicans. His continued involvement in covering up the full truth in the Mueller report, as we saw from day one after the Barr letter was released. And now standing in the way regularly of election security. This guy has got to go. There are unfortunately no serious challengers right now on the basis of polling at taking him down in Kentucky. I know that there is at least one declared candidate. That candidate, from the polling I've seen, is not standing any chance at this point in time. This guy's got to go. And as much as we need to get rid of Trump, Mitch McConnell has become an extremely effective, I don't even know what to call him. He's been an extremely effective operative for some of the bigger Republican successes over the last 10 years. It's disgusting, and most of it is legal. We have a voicemail number. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. I got a bunch of voicemails in the last 24 hours accusing me of deplatforming fellow progressive host Sam Seder. Like, I don't even understand what they're talking about. Listen to this.
What up, DP? Longtime fan here. I've been listening to you before you hit puberty. Was listening to you when you came out that you weren't gay. Quite sad about that, actually. But I'm actually calling, kind of upset. You deplatformed my boy Sam Cedar, and we need to figure out why you deplatformed him. So I'm hoping you're willing to address that situation of deplatforming Sam Cedar. This is Jason from the 707.
I don't know what this guy's talking about, and here's another one.
Hey, David, I don't know if you saw the Sam Cedar show today, but he totally talked about you. He said that you are, by not showing his entire clip, you totally deplatformed him, bro.
What?
So I think you should totally respond to that, and then we'll see what Sam has to say to defend himself against your deplatforming. Keep up the fight.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, listen, I think that this is maybe someone coming to tattle to me about Sam Cedar's response to someone else tattling about tattling, or at this point, it's like a endless. It's like those Russian matryoshka dolls. I don't know how else to describe it. I don't know what is going on. I don't know anything about deplatforming Sam Cedar. I don't know what these people are talking about, but I will try to check out that clip. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We'll talk about the new New York City tenant law that has landlords very, very fired up. I also want to talk about a division within the Democratic Party about whether they should give themselves the 2.6% cost of living raise that they are due in January. And I also want to talk about Ted Cruz apparently wants to team up with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to make birth control available over the counter. But this is actually a stealth free market conservative move. Doesn't mean we should oppose it if it's the right thing to make birth control available over the counter. Without a prescription, then it should be. But I do want to explain to you what Ted Cruz's ulterior motives are, because they are exactly what you would imagine them to be. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at www.joinpakman.com or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.